This presentation is about education reform in Mexico. Now, Mexico is a very large country with many different kinds of areas. You have urban areas, you have rural areas, you have folks who live in mountains, folks who live in deserts. You also have an indigenous population, many of which speak a different language, some of which don't speak Spanish at all, but most of the country does speak Spanish. In fact, it's the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. It is in the top 15 for its economy, oil production, silver mining, and a number of people visiting the country. There are estimates that will be in the top 5 or the top 10 by 2050. It does have a democratic government. It does have scandals for voting fraud and has had changes over the years. They have a police force, judicial system, but again, there are complaints of corruption and other issues. There's also a large income disparity, especially in the rural areas and with the indigenous population. Education in Mexico should sound pretty familiar. You have the primary grades and the grades for our equivalent of our junior high. Students from grades 1 to 9 are required to attend school. However, grades 10 through 12 are not mandatory. There are different kinds of school from grades 7 to 12. You have technical schools, you have college prep schools, you also have the International Baccalaureate and some other choices for students depending on what their skills are and what their goals are for the future. There's been education reform in Mexico. Mexico wants to be a first world country in development, and they acknowledge that they need to have an educated population for the economy and for the labor market. They do put their money where their mouth is. They've dedicated about 25% of their annual budget to education. They've passed laws. They have followed the lead of the United States of a kind of no child left behind, high stakes testing format. One of the issues that many people have is that they do hold their their teachers responsible for the scores on these high stakes tests. And yet, many teachers don't feel they have enough input into those tests. There is a test no one can argue with, and it is the PISA. It's an international test, and Mexico does not do very well compared to other countries of a similar format. They spend a lot of money on education, but they are not getting the results that they expect for the money that they're spending. Now, one of the things in Mexico is the teachers' union. The teachers' union is a big part of the politics of education. There's one union, the SNTE, which is big in the political world. They have a lot of power. They are part of a union that the PRI began whenever they had power. They do have influence on who is elected. The union also is for all school workers, not just teachers. Now, that influence and that power can lead to corruption. There's also another union, the CNTE. They have power as well. They've gained even more since the head of the other union was arrested and imprisoned for corruption. There are still talks of corruption and still issues with the union's educational reform and the political and economic change that's going on in Mexico. It's all very interconnected. One of the things that the country needs to do in order to embrace educational reform is let go of the past. There are some traditions that have been done in teaching that are outdated and seem almost outrageous or even corrupt. They have things like you used to pass on your teaching position when you retire to a family member or to a friend, or even sell it as part of your retirement thing when you leave. Teachers feel like they are not being represented, that they are being looked down upon because they are all about testing and they don't get to set the standards and the curriculum. It's foreigners that are deciding what's going to happen since they're following a model like No Child Left Behind in the United States. and you have the PISA test and all of these things that are putting pressure, and they don't think that these people really understand their students. So one of the things they really need to do is make the teachers part of this reform. But again, this is a challenge because of the blending of the politicians and their union. It's hard to get a clear idea of what agenda is being put on the table when they're talking about reform. And there are just concerns with change. There are genuine concerns with the change to a No Child Left Behind testing format, with teachers paying evaluations based on student performance on the test. They are getting students from a wide range of backgrounds, as I mentioned earlier. You can have students who are in very, very poor areas, and they're finding that those people in the very poor areas are simply not doing well in the education system. They are not succeeding in helping the poor and the indigenous population become successful. And that is a big problem and a big concern, that the No Child Left Behind model is not going to fix the problem with the poor and with their education. There have been other countries that have had some success with education reform, so perhaps they can consider studying some of those others and considering those for future reforms, especially when it comes to identifying how to help the poor and the underrepresented. It is transitioning to a first world developing country, and the educational system is going to need to follow suit. They're trying, and there's so many different experts on how this can happen, so hopefully they find something that works for them and works for their country, works for their teachers, and works for their politics. I have a little diagram here that shows some of the political economy. They're willing to throw money at the problem. They're 25% of it, their money, their annual funding is going there. They're trying to find ways to fix things. They're embarrassed by their performance on the PISA test, and they want to fix things. Now, their ideology is that changes must happen. Problem is, there's disagreement on how to make that happen. They want an educated workforce. They want to be a first world country. Now, the schooling is set up a lot like the United States. You have grade 1 through 9. They must complete those. Unlike the United States, grades 10 through 12 are not mandatory, and there's a large disparity between the educational performance of the poor and indigenous populations compared to the rest of the population. And a lot of your poor and indigenous are not going on to the grades 10 through 12, and that is one of the things that was pointed out by the PISA test, that they need to move on to grades 10 through 12 as well, and they need to get more people to not only do grades 10 through 12, but also move on to higher education. They have a pretty low number on who are moving on to higher education as well, and that is a problem if you're going to be a first world country. So, that is Mexico in a nutshell. Here is a list of my references that I used in this. They are fascinating and hopeful. They are transitioning and emerging and reforming things in order to improve. Thank you for listening, and have a lovely day.